All right, well, thank you very much indeed, and it's great to be here today. I think the reason I'm moderating this is that I have spent my last 35 years as a reporter, as a journalist at the Financial Times. One of the things I did while I was at the FT was about 5 years ago, I created a newsletter and platform called Moral Money, which was the first sustainability newsletter in the mainstream media until that point. Since then, a lot of other papers have come in and done the same thing. But I spent the last 4 or 5 years covering climate issues and sustainability issues very, very intensively, originally as a hobby, and then I hired a team to actually run the platform. But I should say that I'm really thrilled to be here today, because before I became a reporter, I was actually a cultural anthropologist. I did both a BA and a PhD here in Cambridge at Clare College. And back then, when I was an anthropologist, students were basically divided into 2 tribes. There was a minority of people who wanted to go out and save the world, who wore tie-dye and were mostly anthropologists and things like that, and chained themselves to bulldozers and were very deeply passionate about the environment and social issues. And there was a big bunch of people who wanted to go and work for Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and Price Waterhouse and all that, and basically wanted to understandably save themselves and have a career and make money. And for the most part, the anthropologists tended to scorn the others and assume that if anyone was going to save the world, it was going to be people like me who were chaining themselves to bulldozers and waving placards and things like that. Well, the great humbling surprise that has happened to me in the last 5 to 10 years has been to wake up and discover that that image of a divide is 100% wrong. And actually, it may end up being accountants and engineers who save the world, not people like me who used to wear tie-dye. And the reason is that at the very same time that groups like the FT have started writing about sustainability and climate and putting it at the centre of their coverage, not in a sort of back page bit called the do-gooding section, but it's now in the very centre, often on the front page, a whole range of professions have started to embrace the battle around climate change, and the green activists have realised that actually working with accountants, management consultants, bankers, government officials and diplomats really is the critical issue now. So what that means is that if you care about the climate today, there are many, many ways that you can get engaged in trying to fight climate change. And the fact that you're having this event tonight is just fantastic, because it indicates that many of you want to do exactly that through all manner of paths. So I'm really excited to see you all tonight, and we have a fantastic couple of people to talk to us about how you can get involved in lots of different ways and to give you their tips about what has driven their careers and their path to where they are today. We've got Glada Lahn, I think that's the correct pronunciation, yeah, who is a senior research fellow at Chatham House, who looks particularly at environmental issues. That may not be quite correct, so you can correct me if you want in a moment, but suffice to say that you're very important at Chatham House and you look at green issues. And then we've got Andrew Francis, who is, I see according to his bio, in charge of Head of Climate Diplomacy, Energy, Climate and Environment Directorate at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. I would imagine that means he spends a lot of time at COP28, basically arguing with people about how to push the initiatives forward. But anyway, 2 people with fantastic perspectives, and they're each going to talk for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions about anything you'd like, really. I'm happy to share my views on climate journalism, but I'm also happy to share my own views on what's happening in industry and business from what I saw it and reported on it as a journalist. But these 2 are in prime position because they actually have proper grown-up jobs doing climate things. So perhaps we can start with you, Glada, and tell us how you got to where you are and what you're doing and what advice you'd give this group here.
Thanks very much, Gillian. Can you all hear me? Great. Okay, so first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. This month marks 20 years at Chatham House, which is, I can hardly believe that actually. So it's a nice opportunity to reflect. And I wanted to start with the idea that where you start, or even what you aim for at your age, isn't necessarily where you'll end up. And actually, a lot of what Gillian was saying is really important to where I'm going to go. So I'll come back to some of those ideas of how climate change has become integrated within many parts. So what I'm saying is, whatever you're studying now, if you are interested in having an impact in the area of environment and climate change, there are so many opportunities now to find a way to get involved. So for me, I've done so many jobs. I've worked in a dodgy perfume factory, I've worked in many shops, restaurants, I've worked in a Roman themed restaurant in Jerusalem, and you know, none of them looked like I was heading towards working in climate change, but I learned a hell of a lot along the way. I think career is about creating your journey. So I love the Japanese concept of ikigai, which is about your sense of purpose, your reason for being, and it's about marrying together what you love doing, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can get paid for. And it might not all be met by your career, but the idea is that you're heading towards some sort of complementary balance of those things. I started off studying Arabic at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and did international relations with that as well. Really, really fascinating course, but I left totally unequipped for the world of work. And I remember going to a conference about working in the media, and I took away one thing from that. They told us to network. They told us to go up to people and speak to them and ask them questions, you know, at conferences or seminars or wherever you were. And that was a really brilliant piece of advice. So we'll come back to that later. But basically, I applied for hundreds of jobs and internships, didn't get any of them. I eventually got something as an analyst, which was very hard work and very low pay. I moved to Chatham House, actually taking a further pay cut just to do 2 days a week in research assistance. And I originally started working on a book with which a research fellow there was working on national oil companies in the Middle East. And it hadn't been written about before, and suddenly I was plunged into this world of reserves and barrels and million British thermal units and looking through all this data every day, and I really didn't know my arse from my elbow, so it was a bit of a jump into the fire, but it was a brilliant one because I learned from older people. So that's another thing that I point out is when you are thrown in at the deep end, and it was a huge challenge to get to grips with all the terminology when I first started that job, but meeting older people with more experience and asking for their help was incredibly helpful. And through that, I met colleagues who worked on climate change. Now, what I noticed was that the people who worked on oil and gas and fossil fuels spoke a completely different language to the ones who worked in climate change. I'd go to a climate change meeting, you know, maybe someone would ask me, oh, can you take some notes for this meeting? And I was struggling to keep up with the acronyms, you know, I had to look everything up. And I realized that they were thinking in a much more long-term, normative kind of way, whereas when you spoke to the people in oil and gas, they were talking about markets, they were talking about more short-term trends, and a lot of business and finance terminology. So I've seen those things being brought together, and I hope that I played a role in that. I sort of made it my mission to bring the two groups together, because we cannot solve this problem when 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from fossil fuels, and so I started a roundtable focused on topics that could bring those two together. I later started a new strand of work on policies in the Gulf countries, so some of the biggest producers of oil and gas, and how energy efficiency and renewables was important for them. And that was a really interesting alignment in a way, looking at it from a producer country perspective. That still carries on in my work today. So I kind of would say another learning is if you notice an angle that no one's covering that's important, then kind of keep chipping away at it, keep saying it, and you'll actually attract others who are interested, maybe working on the topic too, and forming partnerships is incredibly important. Loved working with partners in the Gulf countries, for example, on their energy efficiency and renewable energy challenges. But nowadays I work quite a lot on climate risks, and especially a concept of cascading climate risks, so how climate impacts in various parts of the world will interact with socioeconomic dynamics and potentially transmit and cascade through global systems like the food trade, for instance, or migration, and what we can put in place to create greater resilience. Many other things, but I'll stop there, and I just wanted to... Have I got 2 minutes? Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll just run through 3 challenges which Anna and Beth asked me to think about challenges that I've faced, and maybe some of the things you'll find them too. I think getting started when you leave university is incredibly hard. Everybody seems more experienced and authoritative than you, and I'll come back to that piece of advice about the networking that I received at the media conference, because when I did feel like that, I actually found that others did too, and we started with about 4 others. We founded a network back in, it was around 2003, that's loosely called Friends of the Arab World, people who are working on Arab countries in the Middle East, who are just starting out in their careers. They could be diplomats or journalists or artists, bankers, and we started to have small salons, but we also started to tell each other about conferences and things that were on, and that was an incredibly interesting and lovely way to meet people. But also I noticed that those people 20 years later, they are ambassadors, they are CEOs, they run their own NGOs. It's a really lovely network to be part of. Then the other challenge is getting to grips with terminology, which I won't go over, I've just mentioned that, but I think that you can really throw yourself in at the deep end, and again, the lesson of working with people with more experience, offering to edit their work, for instance, help them with editing, that was incredibly helpful, because I got to ask a lot of questions that maybe people feel too embarrassed to ask, and then trying to translate it into language that most people would understand. And talking of language, the final one is communicating. I think we face a real problem in communicating what needs to be done on climate change in a world that is polarized, and where the media in a way feeds on that politicization and polarization of views around resources, the environment, climate change, and so on. So I think it's really important to, what I always say to our academy fellows who come to Chatham House maybe for 9 months to do research, study leadership, I say to them, with your research, it starts with listening. Really listen to others, to your target audience. Listen to how they speak, the words they use, the stories that resonate with them. Because what you write, if you want to have influence in the policy world, really needs to reflect how people think, and what makes sense for them. So I think that listening element is probably the best advice that I give to anyone who's interested in the area of policy impact.
Well, thank you, Glada. That was absolutely brilliant. I strongly echo many of those points, particularly the point about communication and listening, but also about networking, because when I was at Cambridge as an undergraduate, I was chronically shy and basically hid in the backstage of a theatre doing set design all the time because I was so shy. And if anyone had told me back then to go out and network, I would have absolutely, crawled under my duvet and hidden, because I couldn't imagine anything worse. And what I've realised in the intervening years is that what you say is absolutely correct about networking. It comes naturally to a very few people. Most people find it horrifying, and it is not in any way, shape or form something that British people do at all naturally. But the reality is we live in a world where if you want to get ahead, you need to learn how to network, however scary it is. And particularly because I spent the last 15 years living in America, and one of the biggest contrasts I noticed between Cambridge and the American campuses, and I have a daughter at an American campus right now, is that in America, the kids all start networking practically in preschool. I kid not. I mean, they literally are trained from a very young age to get out there and smile at people. I can't give a speech on an American campus without almost the entire auditorium coming up and asking me for my email and asking to get an internship, because they actually need to do internships to get ahead in America at a very young age. And I just mentioned that because you might be sitting in the audience going, ooh, sounds horrible. I totally understand it, but there is a happy medium. And if you're going to get out there and compete on the world stage, the message is, I think we need to basically overcome our Britishness and learn to get out there and talk to people and network a bit more. Anyway, that's a quick thought, and I can talk a lot more about that if you want. But Andrew, you're here hovering over my head like God. Partly because, not partly, because you have got COVID, you poor thing. So you were going to be here tonight and you couldn't come in person. However, it's just brilliant to get you here. So give us your thoughts about how you ended up running climate diplomacy for Britain.
Sure, Gillian, Glada, thank you very much. And again, apologies for not being there in person, everyone. I did intend on coming up to Cambridge. Look, you've set a good test there, Gillian, which is prove that I have a grown-up job, and I will try and do my best over the next 5 minutes to do that. I'll do a couple of things. I will start off by explaining, I suppose, my role, but also the types of roles that you get in the Foreign Office, but also Whitehall, but actually some of what's good and what's challenging about it. In terms of my role, I suppose I've been the FCDA's head of climate diplomacy for about 3 years now, just over 3 years, and I started it. It was about 10 months before the UK hosted COP26, which is arguably actually the best time to do it. It wasn't a particularly defined role, which meant I had the ability to build a team, build a structure, and build the function, which was pretty fantastic. There are 3 things, if I had to simplify, that I do in my job. One is overseeing a network of climate attachés around the world. We have about 200 of those around the world, and I'm pretty fair in saying that it's the envy of a lot of countries for not only its size but also its expertise. I also run a lot of our international climate engagements for our ministers and our senior officials. Now, really, ultimately, that's about lobbying countries and key countries. You want to drive a lot of ambition around the world. You want countries to meet their commitments. That includes a lot of planning for a lot of major moments in the calendar, your UN General Assemblies, your G20s, your G7 summits, and that sort of thing. And the third bucket is planning for COP. So yes, indeed, I have spent a lot of my time at COPs and maybe not arguing quite, but strongly trying to influence people to do more on it. So I'm responsible for our planning within the FCDA for that, and they have, I suppose, become the biggest international moments of the year, and I'll come on to that a bit in a minute. I suppose, how did I get that job? I mean, I think the first thing for me to say is that I really wouldn't consider myself a climate expert. In fact, I wasn't even really a policy expert before I did this job 3 years ago. I was actually known as a comms expert. I've worked in the civil service for about 12 years now. It's pretty much straight out of university. And actually, I worked in the Cabinet Office and Downing Street first in press and comms. And then I moved to the Iraq Inquiry as spokesman, and then to what was the FCO. I headed up our comms for Europe and then Central Asia, which included a lot of Russia work. And then actually in COVID, I was part of the response to heading up our international comms on that. And then I decided to apply for this job. It was interesting. I didn't know more in climate change than what you see on TV or David Attenborough documentaries. And I thought I'd give it a go. And to be honest, I look back and think, why did they give me the job? I mean, to be honest, I think I actually got it because I'd worked on the big issues at the time. I suppose I'd managed a lot of large teams, I'd a lot of contact with ministers, run global networks, and a lot of cross-Whitehall coordination. I led a couple of Queen's speeches, for example, in Number 10, which is a lot of work in getting departments to do things for you. So I think actually one of my key messages there would be that certainly within the Foreign Office, it's very much a generalist organisation. It's actually the skills, it's the intellect, and it's the hard work that counts. It's about applying that to a new area. So that does mean that there's actually lots of different routes that you can take to work on climate change. And I'd actually say there's probably about 3 buckets of careers, not only in FCDA, but also I'll cover a bit of Whitehall here as well. One is in London, you can be a specialist. I work in FCDA with lots of experts. I mean, there are people who are they can talk to you for hours about forests and sustainable agriculture and loss and damage, water, international financial systems or critical minerals. And of course, departments like the Department for Energy and Security, Net Zero, DEFRA, have even more expertise because they are the thematic leads on that. But I suppose you also get, within London and FCD in particular, you get generalists, you get diplomats. So it's people like me, for example, who have, they can have years of diplomatic or political experience, and that can be leading bilateral relationships, it could be leading multilateral negotiations, for example, but they now use those skills and apply them with a climate lens. And I can say frankly, I suppose I've led successfully 3 COPs summits here, but I actually can't tell you in fantastic detail all about the Loss and Damage Fund or the merits of the Forest and Climate Leadership Partnership. But the point is that I don't need to know that to do my job effectively. I suppose what I need to know is understanding the top 5 big ticket items that we need to deliver throughout the year and how we can use all of our diplomatic assets to deliver those. So really defining, what are the key countries that we need to influence over the course of a year? How do we develop a plan? How we lobby those countries and using our assets like our ministers or our ambassadors? How do we build a coalition of like-minded countries, for example, to help us do that, or manage or maintain a network of diplomats around the world? I suppose we also have jobs at post, and we have about, as I say, 200 attaches in our network, and some of those are what we would consider UK-based diplomats that will go out on a posting for 3 or 4 years. They might be ahead of climate change somewhere, and also locally engaged and locally employed staff as well. The big advantage to those jobs, of course, is that you get really detailed, in-depth understanding of the country, you really get to influence them. So my message there is, it's really important to understand what interests you. Is it the politics, is it the science of climate change? Because there is a place for both, and that might influence your career choice. I would just quickly say some of the good things about my job and maybe some of the challenges. I think probably the best is the scale of the work. I mean, I would genuinely say that climate change now, I was saying climate as a general point, is a pillar to almost every international relationship that we have, and it also links to almost every other issue. It can be security, trade, migration, education, gender, you name it. There is a link to climate change, which also means that I'm often involved in lots of different issues that come up to some degree, and it's actually really great to see over the last few years how much that's been mainstreamed. It gives you a lot of exposure if you work on these issues. The second thing I'd probably say is just the freedom to shape things, from defining which countries that you think are the most important to influence, to actually just writing what the most senior actors say. It is very empowering. If the Prime Minister is speaking to a world leader on a climate issue, it will be my team that will be writing what they say. You really feel that you can have an impact by doing that and being in those meetings. I'd also say the importance of COP summits, actually. I genuinely think they've now become, I think it's pretty much argued that they've become the main Saffron moment of the year, which gives us a very, very large platform, those of us working on climate change. I worked a lot on His Majesty's visit to UAE, and it's very cool to be able to have that exposure to inspire action and to work on a speech like that. I would say you get to visit some pretty amazing places. The government spends 11.6 billion on various different climate programs around the world, and you get to see those in action. Over the last year, I suppose I spent time with David Attenborough's team in Costa Rica in the jungles, filming ants. If you can, that's very interesting. But also, visiting irrigation projects in Nepal. You get to do quite a lot. You get to see and learn quite a lot on the ground. And I'd also say just the passion and commitment from staff. I would say it's probably, working with genuine experts has been amazing, and people have worked on this for years. It's quite different when you work as a diplomat. You tend to work a lot on issues that come and go, and actually I know that I'm building knowledge in this job that I will take with me. I spent a lot of my career working on Brexit, actually, which I thought is pretty redundant now, actually, there's a knowledge base, whereas actually climate I know will take with me. I'll just quickly say some challenges there. I mean, there's caveats to that. I say that climate is involved in everything, but I suppose it can be a double-edged sword because the scale and the demand are huge. It's definitely the busiest job I've ever had. I think the number of people that want a piece of you is very, very large. So I think defining that down into something deliverable has been a challenge. Which countries and which issues will actually have the biggest impact. I think making sure that we keep the money and the resources focused on this agenda. We don't have a COP presidency anymore in the UK, so I constantly keep beating the drum for how we make sure that we focus our resources on this. And I think it also is actually just, it can be frustrating sometimes. You see just how much the politics can distract from this. COP26 was interesting because it was a really defining moment. I think largely very possible because it happened at the right time. It happened just as COVID was coming to an end. the world unified on this, and it actually showed that climate can be a very unifying agenda. But I suppose you look at Russia-Ukraine, you look at Israel-Gaza, it just shows that you're often competing for attention at the top of that political table. So you're constantly making the case to keep the momentum up on these very long-term existential threats, and as well as dealing with the immediate global crises. So for me, that's meant you have to be really clever in the way that you pitch things, you have to find new links between climate and other issues, you have to reframe asks that we previously had as offers to different countries in the world as well. And it also means having to work with lots of other different countries to maximise your impact. So actually, I think that's probably helped me, but it's definitely more of a challenge. I will leave it there, but obviously having to unpick any of that.
Well, thank you, Andrew. That's very helpful indeed. I guess I'd like to ask both of you, if you were talking to somebody who said, I want to get involved in changing the world and getting involved in climate change, would you suggest to them first that they get a science degree or work in engineering and things like that? I mean, how would you see the top priority right now? Glada?
Yeah, that's a really good question, since I didn't do those kind of subjects, and hence my difficulty with all the terminology. So I think there's a huge value in doing engineering or environmental science or geology, for the kind of path that I took. Having said that, a lot of it, as Andrew and Gillian have both kind of made clear, is about people and communication and sociology and anthropology. So there's a lot of avenues you can go down, and it's not, as Andrew said, there's a policy track, there's a scientific track, there's a social track. So I don't know what I'd recommend. I was actually recently asked this question, and I did say engineering in this particular case, but that was because of the individual and what they were good at. So I think it does come back to what I was saying at the beginning about what you love and what you're good at. Of course, you don't always find that out straight away, but it's good to have a passion for something that you study, and then amazingly, for instance, with Arabic, it comes in, and Middle East studies, it comes into my work a lot, because a lot of my work ends up focused in the Middle East, and being able to speak the language and understand the politics really comes in useful. So yeah, I don't think I'd narrow it down.
Right. What about you, Andrew? What would you say?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I'll answer this in a few ways. One thing I would say is the more I've gone into my career, the more I've realised that what it is that you study at university matters less. First of all, you get very obsessed with your studying, that my degree is the be-all and end-all. Take from your degree, make your degree work for you, I think is what I would say. And I think this gets to the point of networking, actually. The soft skills when you're there, making the connections, thinking about internships. I mean, my job pretty much for a living is networking. I'm similar, I'd probably say I was naturally an introvert, actually, and I've spent a lot of my time just constantly kind of working a room, and you have to build the energy to do it. So I think learning those skills are more important, actually, and will serve you better in the long term. So I'd say not obsessing over that. My point would be, I suppose, think about what area of climate change you want to work in. I would split it into two buckets. You get people who are experts on a particular area, and it might be beneficial to have a degree in environmental sciences in some form. But if you're interested in the policy side, you don't need a degree in that. You really don't, actually. I mean, a lot of people pretty much everybody I work with, they don't necessarily have a background in that academically, but they have got a job in the place they want to work, or in government or in an NGO, and now work on it and develop the information and the knowledge base on the back of that. So I would say, do what you think you're going to be successful in, what you have an interest in. If you want to have a policy job or work on the politics, you focus on that. I mean, I studied politics. My master's was in international relations, and I worked on climate change through that lens. I haven't needed an academic background to it.
I would say a basic understanding of economics is useful.
Yeah, I would say, someone who did anthropology and thought economists were dreadful during most of my career, I've since come to realise that that was driven partly out of fear. And two things I would say is, firstly, you have to treat jargon just like any other language. And if you can learn French, if you can learn Latin, if you can learn German, you can learn jargon, whether it's banking jargon or economics jargon or anything else. For my PhD, I was in Tajikistan, so I had to learn Tajik. And I remember turning up on the FT economics desk and thinking that learning economics jargon was even harder than Tajik, primarily because the people who spoke it were so darn arrogant, and they used the jargon as a kind of tool of power to make it hard for everyone else to understand what they were doing. But the same thing applies to banking jargon, medical jargon, or climate change jargon. And there's a lot of climate change jargon, but anybody can learn it. It just requires having the courage to not succumb to being scared. And I think that's really important. The second thing, a quick thing I'd simply add to that is that having built this team at the FT to cover, green business and green finance and markets, I can't stress strongly enough that there is a whole world out there which is emerging really fast and what's going to be critically important in the coming years around green audit, the people who are going to go into companies and actually measure whether companies are living up to what their PR machine says, and try to track things like climate change emissions and how you actually record it on corporate balance sheets, which is absolutely critical to pushing for change. There's a whole world out there of green investment, people who are deciding to invest either in big banks or in venture capital firms in green projects. Again, it's absolutely critical. There's a whole world out there of green entrepreneurships and people using tech skills in unusual ways. And just to give an example of this, Al Gore, who I've known for many years, and who's actually coming, I'm bringing him over to talk in Cambridge on May the 12th, and he's going to be thundering in the chapel. He's a great thunderer. He came to a party during UN Climate Week in September, and Al came along, and it was pouring with rain, and he stood on my barbecue in my backyard in New York and thundered for about half an hour with a sort of apocalyptic kind of manner. So all the neighbours stuck their heads out of the windows to kind of listen to it. But one of the things he talks about is not just thundering about how angry he is about oil and gas companies or anything else like that. He talks a lot about a project which is completely counterintuitive but totally critical, which is he's working with satellite companies right now with a project called Climate Trace. I'd urge any of you who are interested in tech to look it up, to use all the satellite feeds they can find, they can rent, in orbit, and track in enormous detail emissions from different companies and countries and cities around the world. They're creating a massive map. And the reason it's so counterintuitive is that once they've got that data, they're creating an open fire hose for any entrepreneurs around the world who want to use that data for free and build products that they can then sell to investors to help investors track exactly what companies are emitting what where. And that's the kind of job that you'd never find in any normal climate careers advice program, because it involves financiers and techies and satellite experts. But it's exactly the kind of thing that me as a kind of, naive 21-year-old when I was wearing tie-dye could not have imagined as actually being probably a lot more effective and powerful going forward than just waving a placard or something like that. So, one other question I'd like to ask you both quickly before we turn to the audience is, if you feel really angry about climate change and you want to be an activist or protest or do something, to try and change the trajectory we're on, which I totally understand, is it better in your view to do it outside the system and yell at people, or to be inside the system, in the establishment, and try and change it from within? Do you end up selling your soul if you go inside the establishment, or can you actually get more done?
Okay, hugely important question. And one that...
By the way, we're all officially part of the establishment, so we're not exactly neutral.
I'm totally establishment. Chatham House is probably as establishment as it gets. However, one of our former associate fellows, while she was still associate fellow, glued herself to the pavement outside Shell, quite famously. We have, it's up to us whether we go on protests or, do other things outside of work. In my particular think tank environment, I'm not sure how it is, but Andrew, you can answer for yourself. So that's up to us. We have a really strong sense of independence at Chatham House. But However, most of us have taken a track of trying to move people together as much as possible. So a lot of change that I see that's come about, whether that's in the food sector, whether that's in oil and gas, whether that's in renewables and new technologies, is because there was a bit of everything. There was lobbying from the activists that were pushing companies to make change. There were shareholders who were asking for it, and there were people who took note of powerful speeches made by Hollywood personalities, or people like Al Gore, was incredibly influential with his film and Convenient Truth. The people who've been influenced in that way, and then our role at Chatham House is really bringing together decision makers often alongside experts and trying to inform policy in the best possible way, showing the different angles, perspectives, but also solutions. And a lot of the research we do is on practical solutions, so really going quite deep into what would work given the current circumstances and given what we would like to happen in future. So we try to move the dialogue along that track. And then, of course, then you need people who can actually make decisions, and they often sit in positions where they feel they don't have a lot of movement. Political people in politics feel more and more constrained by what the media says, and whether they're going to get through the next election. So that is a serious problem. So I think there's a place for each of those, and maybe if I concentrate on the role that we play is to try and provide some stable, long-term view and a safe space, a safe, trusted space to be able to articulate ideas, but also to face criticism behind closed doors.
Thank you. I think the one thing that unites people from all political parties and activists right now is, if in doubt, blame the journalists. But Andrew, do you think it's better to be in the system and try and change it from within, or are you a closet, secret, wannabe revolutionary out from outside? You're speaking what looks like a bit like sort of the Paris, Louvre or shopping mall or something. So you don't look much like a revolutionary right now.
This is actually the Foreign Office behind me. So I would definitely say inside. Now you would imagine I would say, of course, I'm inside the system. But first thing I would say is that activists have done a great job. Young people in particular have done a great job in recent years in terms of putting this in the mainstream and on the agenda. I would absolutely, there's definitely a place for it. The thing I found particularly interesting working on the inside as somebody that's come at it afresh, so whose only exposure to this really was that kind of activist world and what you saw on the news and read in the newspapers, is a few things. One is you get a lot of say on the inside. I mean, it's quite surprising. It's quite shocking, actually. You can be a relatively junior member of staff, but you have the power, the influence to influence very, very big, important meetings, because you can be what would be the equivalent of a fast street grade in the Foreign Office, but you are the one telling the minister what to say. Where else do you get that, frankly, but the inside? And to a lot of this, actually, it's not them coming back and questioning what you're saying. You get to actually make the decision on that. So I think one is, it's sort of a bit of power there. But secondly, I think actually is you understand on the inside how hard this is, and how hard the politics is of this. So I'll give you an example. It was best described to me actually by the previous head negotiator for the UK. People question a lot of, but in particular when I was at COP26, there's a lot of protesters kind of questioning, why can't we reach an agreement on this? Why does everything get watered down, right? And everyone wants more, so you could always argue, well, why is this the case? It's because there wasn't the political will. Whereas actually, imagine the UNFCCC system requires all parties to agree. So 197 parties need to agree on something. It's basically like finding 197 people that you know, try to invite them around for dinner, so get everybody to agree on a day that they can go for dinner, and a time, and the restaurant, and then you have to get everybody to agree what to have for a starter, and a main, and a dessert, and drinks. Everybody has to have the same. quite difficult, and you end up then, by the end of it, you kind of have you haven't got the strongest outcome, right? Because what can you have that satisfies everybody? And that's what it's like on the inside, trying to be a climate negotiator. And you only kind of know that on the inside of the system. So it means that you actually celebrate the wins a lot more. Because sometimes you get these agreements and you go, blimey, that's amazing that we've got 197 people to agree to that. So I think it gives you a bit of a different perspective on it as well. And the final thing I would just say is links to other issues. You can see those links a little bit more. And actually, to your previous point, Gillian, I would actually say that sometimes it can actually be detrimental being too much of an expert in climate change, because you can sometimes be that person around the table that's giving all the kind of scientific arguments. You can see some people's eyes gloss over. And actually, it's the people that can link it to the politics. It's the people that can, if I ask 25 climate experts or 25 reasons for something, they would give me 25 reasons. I just need 3. And actually, sometimes it's the people's ability to just really actually take something, really simplify it, and really link it to what else is going on in the world. I think being on the inside helps you do that. So that would be a lesson I would give other people here, which is sometimes actually it's the people that can understand global politics and how it links to climate change can be the ones that have the say in the room and have the ear of some of the most senior people.
Right, thank you. Right, well, any questions from anybody to any of us, preferably Andrew and Glada, because they're the experts, and it'd be courteous but not compulsory just to identify yourself briefly. I don't know if we have a roving mic. If not, you'll just have to shout.
Okay, I'll shout. Hi, I'm Miriam. Thank you so much for taking the time. I was really happy to hear that all of you mentioned kind of the importance of climate change communication, because that's very much what I'm studying, or I'm coming at it from psychology, but very much applied to climate change. And I guess as I think about careers going forward, that might be an option to me. I'm familiar with what academia has to offer, but I'm less familiar with the kind of options for careers on the more social side of climate change outside of academia. And all your career paths sound really fascinating, but it does sound like a theme is that you all kind of fell into it. And so I guess for someone like me, if I don't want to, as I kind of try and plan my life, if I don't want to hope on chance, what kind of, how do I end up maybe with more of a guided approach in your kind of world?
Well, what you're thinking, I'll simply say, if you're interested in psychology and sociology and climate change, that was not really a field anywhere until quite recently. But the good news is that it's becoming increasingly clear to governments that if they're going to try and actually get populations to embrace some of the things they're suggesting, they're going to need to think about the psychology and the cultural messaging and the sociology around it quite a bit. And there are groups like Behavioural Insights, a guy called Derek Halpern, previously at King's, created, which has been doing a lot of work around psychology and sociology and things to try and look at many, many issues, but including climate change and how you create nudges in the population. There are social science consultancies like RED, R-E-D, or Stripe, or IDEO. Many of them are in America, where it's much better developed, which again are trying to use sociological analysis to explore climate change. What I found from my own life, and I have been extraordinarily lucky in how I fell into things, is that often having two skills or two passions which you want to try and connect in some way is often a very good way to proceed. So in my case, I have anthropology and economic journalism, and most of my career has been trying to combine the two. It's a bit like building a bridge where you have two pillars and you build a cross, and that gives you a fairly unique USP. But there are lots of other ways to do that. And if you are passionate about psychology and about climate change, you don't necessarily have to connect them both immediately, but if you can keep them both in mind in some way, you might well find a way to connect them in the future. And for me, one of the most guiding principles in life has been a comment from Steve Jobs. He gave I think it was 2005 Stanford University graduation speech, which is absolutely brilliant. Recommend any of you watch it because you can find it online. Where he basically said, you can't join up the dots of your life looking forward. You just have to create dots and trust that they will join up when you look back. And that's been the story of my life. It sounds like it's been the story of your life. And it's been the story of most people I know who've had really interesting lives. That it doesn't really matter if you follow psychology first or follow climate change first, but if you keep them both in mind, you'll find a way of joining up those dots at some point.
Yeah, just really second that. I mean, I have a colleague, Ruth, and she came to us from Ipsos, the polling company, and that was really fascinating experience. She wasn't, she didn't necessarily start off on environment and climate change, but became really fascinated in what people thought about those subjects and how that was changing and how it was different regionally. And she brings a lot of interesting experience to our work from a societal perspective. And yeah, I would just second, like, find a job, like any job really. You learn things from your first, second, third forays into the job market, even if you hate it.
Especially if you hate it.
Especially if you hate it.
And also try and skate to where the puck's going, as they say in America. Try to imagine what's going to be needed in 10 years' time. The reality is that if we are going to try and implement a whole bunch of climate change policies without massive voter rejection, we're going to have to think about psychology and sociology a lot more. Andrew?
Yeah, that was really interesting. Obviously, social behavioural science in particular is very close to my heart. I did a lot of work on nudging as part of my comms background. And to be honest, look, I would say what you're interested in now, don't make the assumption that you'll be interested in it as well in 10 years' time. You know, things change. So I would say give yourself as much flexibility actually in your career as possible. The thing that I've always actually quite liked is having, I agree completely with Gillian's point actually about have two things, have a skill where you can, have something that you can point to and say I'm good at. Like for me, my anchor really across my career has been comms, has been communications, and for example, when you're a diplomat, that's a really respected skill. If you want to be an ambassador somewhere, that's probably one of the first things they will look at. And it's very, very applicable to lots of different careers, and every organisation in the world will have a comms team. It also links a lot to public affairs increasingly now. So maybe, do think about, do you have a particular skill set? And actually, just generally, when you're talking about climate, ESG, just general sustainability is becoming a part of every organisation. The number of chief sustainability officers that you now see popping up in organisations is huge. It's not going anywhere. They will always be hiring people, and this is only ramping up the agenda. So I would say don't try and pigeonhole yourself too much. Don't think I have to find the perfect job straight off the bat. You don't, and your job, the first job you get out of university will look very different to the fifth or sixth job that you do. Just think about the skills and the applicability of my skills to other things, because I think actually you sleep better at night knowing that you've got flexibility and that you can do multiple different things. So do think about that.
Any more questions? Got one in the back.
Hi, I'm sorry, I will try to shout, but my name is Aniska. I study environmental policy here in Cambridge, and I was just wondering, often when you look at kind of policy analysis jobs, they are very focused on the quantitative side, like the economics, the statistics and stuff, and then it feels like you end up competing with people who have actually studied economics, and who are interested in climate change, but more as like a way of connecting their degree or like a hobby in a sense. So they have all of these hard skills, and then you come and you're like, yeah, I've studied climate change in various different perspectives and stuff, and you know a little about a lot, but you don't have the same hard skills. So how would you recommend you kind of compete with those people?
I just say that, having a PhD in cultural anthropology based on Tajik wedding rituals is not an obvious background to go into writing about derivatives in the City of London. And when I first, I started my life actually as a war reporter because the community I was working in was devastated by civil war. And, joined the FT assuming that the only thing I ever wanted to write about was, small wars and human rights. And got thrown on the economics team and, thought there was absolute hell and basically thought, okay, I'll stick here for 6 months and then try and get out again. And then realised that actually economics looks really scary from the outside, but if you have the skills to get through a Cambridge degree, anybody can learn economics and learn the language and finance. So I'd personally say, if you think that's going to hold you back, try and do a bit of economics. Try and learn the jargon. Treat it like a language. Just get enough to be able to sound vaguely credible. And if all else fails, become a journalist. But I'm joking. But it's not like you're going to leave Cambridge with just your perfect skill set. Get out and learn a bit. If you need to know a bit of coding, go learn some coding.
And the thing I noticed today is that makes you guys very lucky compared with us, is that there's so much available online, like the LinkedIn courses, the YouTube videos. I mean, my son learns everything from YouTube now, and so it's out there. And when I don't understand something, I hear a new term, and I did join some very intense workshops that we held with the finance community, because that language can be challenging. And it's great because there's Investopedia, or there's some YouTube clip explaining these very complex, well, you think they're very complex terms, and they're broken down into more simple language. And you used to have to go to the library and trawl through a lot of books and manuals before you got there. So I think that is all open. You don't see your degree as a closed sort of avenue.
Yeah, not at all. Andrew.
Yeah, you're asking the right questions, and I think it's good to ask yourself, what are your weaknesses? It's good to ask yourself, what is it I don't know, rather than what I do know. I think too many people go into the jobs market thinking, I know this and I'm going to get a job, but actually it's understanding the weaknesses. And actually, when you end up working in the civil service, you spend half your life being told what you don't know and what you need to improve on, as opposed to what you're good at. Maybe not good for your self-confidence, but it does help you in the career market. I would actually say, think about not just those hard skills, but are you interesting? Do you work hard? Do you network? Do you ask the right questions? When you're in an interview, those are the things that come out. People want people to work for them who have the right attitude. And if you have a career in mind and you've been speaking to those people in advance and you build a network with them, you will be the one with the foot in the door. It won't be the person that has the hard economics degree. So I would say, think about your weaknesses, but do also think about the other ways in to a job, because it definitely helps. And fun thing I'd say, if you're ever interested in a job in the civil service or just general policy making, we're increasingly moving actually to we're not allowed to put education on CVs. When I hire people straight out of university, I'm not allowed to know if they went to university.
Yeah,
I don't know what they studied. It's about the skills, about how do you sell yourself. So actually, sometimes I feel for people who have very expensive or lots of degrees, because you don't say now. I'm not allowed to say what degrees I've got on any of my applications. But I think it's a good thing, because it basically says, what skills have you got, and how can you tell me how you could do the job?
Yeah, I think we've got time for any more questions. Okay, what we're going to do is everyone who wants to ask a question, raise your hand now. We're going to take 2 or 3 of them, okay? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so start with you, and then...
Hi there. It was really nice hearing you speak more about what you do, and it was interesting learning a lot. I was wondering, with regards to Chatham House, what has your experience been so far working at Chatham House, and what was the avenue through which you got in 20 years ago?
Okay, so that's one for you. We had a question there, I think. Yep.
Yeah, mine is more towards Anderson.
Great.
I'm Stella. I'm an MPhil student in environmental policy as well. My question is about being a student in environmental policy. I'm hoping to work in international climate negotiation and hoping to be at COP as a negotiator, but wondering, I'm from the US, and I'm not necessarily sure that I want to be doing that as a representative of the US. How to get involved working internationally, not sure if I can work for the UK or other countries here, how to get involved, if that's possible, if you know anything about that.
Okay, well that may be one where you have to basically talk a bit offline to him as well, or bilaterally. But yes, let's have your question, then we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes.
So we talked about making change from the inside and making change radically. I want to learn how from the inside you make that space for the change you want to make. So for you, for example, Gillian, you founded Moral Money. How do you kind of go against the current from within the system? And what kind of challenge do you face doing that? Or do you just go with the current and just steer the current? If that makes sense.
Right. I'll take that one. Okay. So one for you, Glada, one for you, Andrew, and then I'll answer that one.
Sure.
So how do you get a job at Chatham House?
Okay. So I was in a job before Chatham House, which was my first job out of college, where I had to work many hours in the day, and there was really no time to apply for another job. And but one of the lucky things about this job was that I got memberships to IISS, RUSI, Chatham House, there are other think tanks in London, because it was about going to events on the Middle East, taking reports, writing them up, and stuff like that. So there was this great opportunity to network. So I'll come back to the networking thing, because before that had happened, I had tried the more traditional route, which was to ask. I'd heard about Chatham House when I was at SOAS, and felt like it was this, ivory tower sort of foreign policy institute, and I had no idea how to, there was nothing really online, and didn't know how to contact them. But then I found out a lecturer of mine went to work there, so I contacted him and asked for an internship. I heard nothing back, and so that didn't work. But the networking really did, because when I went to events, I thought the only way that I'm going to find another job is by talking to people, asking good questions, like spend time thinking of the kind of question, what question you're going to ask in this event, so that you stand out. And actually that's how people come and talk to you afterwards and say, oh, that was an interesting question, I want to tell you more. Sometimes they won't answer a question on the stage, but they'll come and talk to you afterwards. And one of the people that I met was this lady who was writing a book on oil companies, and I ended up emailing her a few times afterwards with interesting articles that I'd come across on the oil companies. But eventually, the reason that I really got that job was because I met her when I was swimming. So it was a completely different environment. And then she invited me to her housewarming party. I invited her to a party I was having, and somebody mentioned to her, not me, that I was unhappy in my job, and so she offered me this research position. So all I'm trying to get across is that things can come in many, many different ways. So put those kind of feelers out there. But at Chatham House, if you are interested, do have a look at our website. We have much less internships now because they're paid internships, which is a good thing, but there's many less of them. So, but check for the upcoming opportunities. We also have an academy, but that's mainly for people who are coming from mid-career positions in other parts of the world. There are occasional opportunities, and there's some really interesting dialogues. We have a summer school every year, but that's only for like 16 to 18-year-olds, but we have Common Futures, which is about European and African people interested in policy who come together. There's quite a few, since lockdown, there's quite a few opportunities to get involved in the dialogue and debates online.
Well, thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, so in terms of how to get involved, I would say there's probably 2/3 routes to this. One is trying the UN system, so the UNFCCC, which is the main convention that governs climate change negotiations, and they have a secretariat, for example. You get various different options there. You can work out of New York. Bonn is where they are centred in Germany. But they also have regional field offices all around the world. I mean, they've got various bits in Africa, for example. So you're actually working in the UN system. You run COPs, you run COP negotiations. So I would say that's probably number one as a way to route in. And actually, there are options for other government departments. I know that the FCDO is very tight and very strict in terms of your nationality requirements, but there is less so in other government departments. So there could be opportunities within, DESNES, so Department of Energy Security Net Zero, for example, who actually run COP negotiations for the UK. DEFRA have lots of negotiators as well, but there's negotiators I know that are not British nationals. So it doesn't completely close the door for you. So I think there could be some options in the UK, but also definitely options in the UN system. And then you do get some observance to negotiations as well. So you might find, for example, that you get access to being in an NGO, for example.
Yeah, and I'll say a couple of things. I wouldn't rule out working for the American government, even if you hate your government, even if you are appalled by where it's going. The reality is that there are many incredibly brave people who are working inside the American government today. I'd read the Michael Lewis book, who are trying to make the world a bit better, if not less bad. And I'd absolutely salute them. And that brings me to mind the question of whether it's possible to affect change if you're working inside an organisation that either has goals that you don't really like, or is very slow moving, or basically doesn't get it, or is very frustrating. And the answer is that you know, being outside the system and yelling at the institutions you hate does have its role in society because it helps to move the needle sometimes. But at the end of the day, being inside the system and actually being able to change things in some ways is more effective. But it's a pretty tough job often, and trying to sort of keep the faith and trying to keep pushing is hard. And it depends on how much patience you've got and how much diplomatic skills and how much you're willing to accept that done is better than perfect. And it's better to get 60% rather than keep trying for 100% and get nothing. You know, it's a very individual thing. I'd just say two other points I'll make is that something I've learned is that if you're trying to communicate ideas to people or get things changed, which are hard to do, it's worth thinking about what I call the domino idea of communication. And by that I don't mean dominoes toppling over. I mean a domino has two numbers on it. And if you can find a way to match half of your number with someone else's number and connect with them, you can then bring them on board and then take them to the second half of your number and take them somewhere completely different. But if you try and connect with them with completely different numbers, it doesn't work. So thinking about points of commonality first and then taking them somewhere different, like a domino, is really, really important. And the other thing I'll say is I love your story about getting your job through going swimming. That is absolutely endemic to anybody who has actually had, you know, a good career, I find. When I ask people how they've got their jobs, how they've advanced, how they got inspiration, it's almost never by just reading a career handbook. It's almost always by a bit of luck. But you can make your own luck. And one of the best ways I ever heard of it was somebody at an American campus who said to me, you've got to treat internships and job searches like Tinder, in that you're going to swipe right 100 times and 99 of them will turn out to be dreadful or they won't ever apply. But if you keep swiping, eventually you might actually find one that works. And is that luck or is that making your own luck? I think it's actually tenacity. But the first 19 or so of the articles I submitted to the FT as a freelancer got rejected and thrown in the bin. And I just kept going back until one day, out of sheer luck, the story I'd pitched had just been on the BBC a minute before, by sheer luck, and suddenly they took my article. So you have to basically know it's going to rely on luck. It's not your fault if it doesn't work out, but you can also try and make your luck. And just visualize Tinder if you feel too depressed. Okay, I think that's probably better to let everyone go. So thanks very much indeed for listening, guys, and best of luck.